Is the dog still breathing? That was the first thing Sergeant Marcus Tilden said when he opened his eyes in the recovery room. Not where am I, not what happened, not even am I okay. Just that, just his dog, the nurse standing at his bedside, a woman named Cassidy Brooke, 31 years old, 8 years out of the Army, and still wearing her hair pulled back the same way she had in Kandahar. Looked at him and said, "He's fine, he's right outside. They won't let him in, but he's right outside." Tilden closed his eyes again, and for a moment, the only sound in that room was the beep of the monitor and the soft exhale of a man who had just remembered how to breathe. This is not a story about what happened to Marcus Tilden. This is a story about what happened to Cassidy Brooke 3 days before that moment, and about what 240 veterans did when they found out. Brooke had been working the overnight shift at Fort Dawson Regional Medical Center in Clarksville, Tennessee, for almost 3 years. She'd taken the job because the hours suited her, because the salary was decent, and because the patient population, heavy with active duty personnel, veterans, and military families, felt like the only world she still knew how to navigate. She'd been a combat medic in the 101st Airborne. 2 deployments, Mosul, then Kunar Province. She'd come home in one piece, more or less, and then spent the better part of a year figuring out that in one piece was not the same thing as whole. The hospital was her version of still serving. She wasn't the kind of person who talked about that. She just showed up every night and did the work. Tilden had been admitted on a Thursday, bilateral knee reconstruction. Old injuries from a jump that went bad over Helmand. He was 44, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that came from too many years of forcing yourself not to react. He had a service dog, a Belgian Malinois named Decker, but that was the name from the file, from the VA paperwork. Tilden called him something else. He called him Ghost. Ghost had been trained as a PTSD support animal through a nonprofit out of Fort Campbell. The organization matched dogs with veterans, and the bond that was supposed to take months had taken Tilden and Ghost about 48 hours. The dog slept at the foot of his bed, followed him to physical therapy, sat outside the door of every room Tilden entered. When Tilden's hands started to shake, which happened sometimes in the early morning hours, Ghost would put his head on Tilden's knee without being asked. The hospital had a formal policy about service animals. They were permitted in all patient areas. Ghost had a vest, an ID card, and more documentation than most people carry for their children. Brooke had seen him in the hallway, on her second night, covering Tilden's floor, and had gone down to one knee right there, scratching him behind both ears while Tilden watched from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He likes you," Tilden said. "I like him," she said. That was the whole conversation. But Ghost remembered her after that. Every time she came on shift and passed his room, the dog would stand up and wag once. Not enthusiastically, just deliberately, like a nod, and then settle back down. She thought about that a lot afterward. How a dog can choose someone, how that choice means something. The man who came onto the unit on the night of February 14th had a visitor's badge and a calm face, and nothing in his posture that suggested anything was wrong. He had signed in at the front desk as a family member of a patient on the 3rd floor. He had a name on the log that didn't match any patient's emergency contact list. But the volunteer at the desk was new, and she hadn't caught it, and nobody blamed her later because that wasn't the point. He walked to the elevator. He went to the 4th floor instead of the 3rd. He moved down the corridor like a man who had been there before, or had studied a layout, or both. Brooke was in the medication room when she heard Ghost. She had never heard Ghost make a sound. In 3 nights covering that floor, the dog had been completely silent. No barks, no whining, nothing. So when she heard a low, sustained vocalization, not quite a growl, something lower, something that went straight into the base of your spine, she was already moving before she understood why. She came around the corner and saw him. The man was standing outside Tilden's room. He had something in his hand. Tilden was in his bed. She could see him through the open door, sitting up now, awake, eyes on the man in the doorway. Ghost was between them. Brooke had spent 8 years in the Army and 3 years in an ER-adjacent unit, and she had seen a lot of things, and the thing she noticed first was not the weapon. It was Tilden's face. He was trying to get out of the bed. Bilateral knee reconstruction, post-op day 3, trying to get his legs over the side of the mattress, because the dog was between him and a man with a knife, and his instinct was still, after everything, to put himself in front of the threat. He couldn't make it. His legs weren't there yet. Brooke didn't think. She had never, in any honest retelling of this moment, claimed that she thought. She moved because moving was the only thing her body knew how to do when someone she was responsible for was in danger. And by someone she included Ghost, and by responsible for, she meant in the old way, the way that doesn't clock out. She got between the man and the dog. He stabbed her 4 times before she got her arm up. The 5th one caught her forearm when she blocked. She doesn't remember the pain the way you'd expect. She remembers the sound Ghost made when she went down. She remembers Tilden's voice, very loud, very controlled, a voice that had clearly given orders in worse situations than this, calling for help. She remembers the ceiling of the hallway, the fluorescent light, and thinking with some distant clinical part of her brain, "That's a lot of blood." Then the hallway filled with people, and she stopped keeping track. The man was apprehended in the stairwell by a security guard and an off-duty sheriff's deputy who happened to be visiting his father on the 3rd floor. Later, people would call it luck. The deputy would say he just heard the noise and ran toward it, which was not luck, which was something else entirely, something that can't be trained into a person, only revealed. Brooke went into surgery at 2:47 in the morning. The wounds were serious. One had nicked a small vessel. The surgical team worked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. When she came out, she was stable, and she was moved to a room in the ICU, and her sister, who had driven 4 hours from Bowling Green the moment she got the call, was sitting in the chair beside her bed. Tilden was still in his room. He had refused, apparently, to be sedated, and the nursing staff had reached an informal consensus that they were not going to try to force the issue. He sat in his bed with Ghost's head in his lap and did not sleep. At around 4 a.m., one of the night nurses brought him coffee, and he thanked her in a voice that didn't have much left in it. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked. "We think so," the nurse said. He nodded once and looked out the window and didn't say anything else. Ghost did not leave his side until morning, but every hour or so, the dog would stand up, walk to the door, look down the hallway in the direction of the ICU, and then come back and lie down. Tilden watched him do this every time without saying a word. He understood what the dog was doing. He was checking on her the only way he could. The story got out the way things get out in a military community. Not through the press, not through social media, but through a phone call. Tilden had a buddy, a man named Rourke, a retired ranger who now ran a veterans outreach program out of Nashville. Tilden called him at 6 in the morning and told him what had happened, not emotionally, Just the facts, the way you learn to relay a situation report. Rourke listened without interrupting. When Tilden was done, Rourke said, "What do you need?" Tilden said, "I don't know yet, that was enough." Rourke made 3 calls. Those 3 people each made 3 calls. By noon, the story had moved through every major veterans group, VFW post, and active duty network in a 200-mile radius. By 2 in the afternoon, the first people started showing up at the hospital, not to cause any disruption, not to protest anything, just to be there. They came in 1s and 2s and small groups, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes with a pin on their collar or a patch on their jacket that told you what they were. They signed in properly at the front desk, gave their names, and then went to the waiting area outside the ICU and sat down. When the chairs filled up, they stood along the wall. When the wall filled up, they stood in the corridor. The hospital administration was notified. A liaison was called, the administrator who came down to assess the situation. A woman named Patricia Ingram, who had been managing hospital crises for 22 years, would later tell her husband that she had never seen anything like it. Not the number of people. The quiet. They weren't loud, she said. They were just present, like they had decided collectively that this was a place they were supposed to be, and they were going to be there until they knew she was okay. By the time Brooke's sister walked into the waiting room to get coffee at 4:30 in the afternoon, there were 240 people standing in and around that corridor. Veterans from the Gulf War and Vietnam and Korea, standing next to men and women who'd come back from Fallujah and Ramadi and Korengal. A group of Gold Star mothers who had driven up from Murfreesboro, 3 active duty nurses from the post who'd come on their lunch break and never went back. Brooke's sister stopped at the edge of the room and looked at them. She was not a military person. She was a schoolteacher in Kentucky, and she had spent most of her adult life vaguely worried about her younger sister and quietly unable to fully understand the world Cassidy had chosen. She stood there and looked at 240 people who had never met Cassidy Brooke. Not most of them, anyway. And something in her chest broke open in a way she would spend months trying to find words for. She said, to nobody in particular, "She never told me about this part." A woman next to her, older, a veteran's pin on her lapel, said, "They never do." Brooke came fully conscious that evening at around 7. Her sister was there, her attending physician, a nurse she didn't recognize, a young man named Preston who told her his name 3 times because she kept losing the thread. Her first clear question, not the foggy before-sleep ones, not the half-awake murmurs, but the first fully formed, eyes-open question was, "Where's the dog?" Preston blinked. He looked at her sister. Her sister said, "The dog is fine. He's with Tilden." Brooke nodded and closed her eyes. Then she opened them again. "Is Tilden okay?" "He's okay." "Did they get They got him?" "He's in custody." She was quiet for a moment. The monitors hummed. Outside the window, the Tennessee sky was going dark in that particular way it does in February, all gray and flat and honest. "There are people in the waiting room," her sister said carefully, unsure how to frame it. "A lot of people. Veterans, they've been here since this afternoon." Brooke looked at her. "A lot of people," her sister repeated. "How many?" her sister told her. And Cassidy Brooke, who had come home from 2 deployments without crying in front of anyone, who had held it together through triage and trauma and the long, quiet wreckage of the years after, lay in her hospital bed and wept. Not from pain, not from relief exactly, from the specific, overwhelming feeling of being seen by people who understood what the job costs and had come anyway and were still there. Tilden came to see her the next morning. He made the walk from his room in a wheelchair because his surgical team had forbidden him from attempting to ambulate the distance on his own, and because, in his words, to the nurse who tried to talk him out of it, I wasn't asking. Ghost walked beside the wheelchair with his vest on and his head up. They wheeled him in, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "You did something stupid." "I know," she said. "You could have. I know." He looked at his hands. Then he looked back up. "Why?" he asked, not combatively, not accusingly, just genuinely. The question of a man who understood sacrifice in the abstract and was still trying to understand it in the specific. Brooke thought about it. She thought about Mosul, about a particular afternoon in a particular street, about a choice she'd made in about 3 seconds that she'd been living with for 8 years. She thought about the way Ghost had looked at her from the first night. She thought about Tilden in that hospital bed, trying to get his legs over the side because his dog was in danger, and everything in him still said, "Move." "Because he was scared," she said finally. "Ghost, when I came around the corner, he wasn't growling to be tough. He was scared, and he was standing his ground anyway." She paused. I recognized that. Tilden didn't say anything for a long time. Then Ghost stood up from where he'd been sitting beside the wheelchair. He walked to the side of Brooke's bed. He put his head on the mattress next to her hand. She laid her palm across the top of his head, and he exhaled once, long and slow, and stayed there. "He doesn't do that with people," Tilden said quietly. "I know," she said. "I won't tell anyone." He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. She got the sense that full smiles were something he gave out very rarely and only to people who had been paying close attention for a long time. But it was enough. It was a real thing on a real face, and she held on to it. The man who had come onto the unit that night was charged with 4 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of aggravated assault, and several additional charges related to his presence in the facility. His motive, as it emerged over the following weeks, was something tangled and ugly and entirely disconnected from Tilden or Brooke or Ghost. A grievance that had festered in the dark, that had attached itself to a target that made no logical sense, that had walked itself through a hospital door on Valentine's Day with a visitor's badge and a borrowed name. These things don't always have the kind of logic you can point to. Sometimes the only thing you can say about them is that someone stood in the way. Brooke spent 11 days in the hospital. She had 3 follow-up surgeries over the next 4 months, all successful, all outpatient after the first. The wound to her forearm left a scar that her sister kept trying to get her to cover up with a tattoo, and that Brooke kept declining. Not because she was precious about it, but because she had decided she was not ashamed of it, and that was different from displaying it. She went back to work in May. Same unit, same overnight shift, same hallway. Her first night back, she rounded the corner toward what had been Tilden's room. A different patient there now, the room turned over and reassigned weeks ago, and stopped. There was a small pin on the wall beside the door. Not a plaque, not a formal installation. Someone had put it up without asking permission, and the administration had looked at it and decided that some things are more important than policy. It was a small brass pin, the kind you'd find at a VFW post, with an American flag and a medical cross. Below it, on a strip of adhesive tape that someone had written on with a black marker, were 3 words. She stood here. Brooke looked at it for a long time. Then she straightened her badge, picked up her clipboard, and went to work. 3 months later, she got a card in the mail. No return address. Inside, In handwriting she recognized as Tilden's, spare, angular, the letters of a man who had written too many casualty reports to waste words, was a single sentence. Ghost still asks about you. She put the card on her refrigerator, where it stayed for a very long time, next to a photo of her sister's kids and a takeout menu from a Thai place that had closed the previous winter. Right in the middle of the ordinary things. That was where it belonged, because that is what this story is, finally, underneath all of it. An ordinary act by a person who had decided, a long time ago, in a different country, in a different uniform, that ordinary was never going to be good enough. That when something in front of you needed protecting, you protected it. That the size of the thing didn't matter. That the cost was not the point. Cassidy Brooke stood in a hallway in Tennessee and put herself between a dog and a blade. 240 people came to say, "We saw you." Ghost came to say it too, in the only language he had. A warm weight on a hospital mattress, a long, slow breath, and the quiet, absolute certainty of a dog who had decided that this person was worth staying close to. He wasn't wrong.